James Adler prided himself on his ability to read people. As a corporate manager for a mid-sized tech firm, his daily grind involved navigating office politics and resolving disputes between his team members. That skill didn't just stay in the office, though. It bled into his personal life. James often joked that he could smell a lie before it even left someone's mouth. He had always trusted his instincts, which made what happened that evening all the more unnerving. It started like any other Thursday night. James had just finished cleaning up after dinner, a quick spaghetti bolognese he had thrown together, while Emily, his wife of 8 years, caught up on a call with her friend Sarah. They had a comfortable rhythm in their lives, one built on shared routines and mutual respect. Yet lately, James couldn't help but notice an invisible gap between them. It was nothing overt. Emily still laughed at his jokes, and they still shared a kiss each morning before work. But there was a hesitancy in her touch, a distant quality in her gaze. James chalked it up to stress or the natural ebb and flow of marriage. After dinner, Emily excused herself, saying she was exhausted from her yoga class earlier that evening. James didn't think much of it. She had been taking yoga classes 3 times a week for the past year, something she had insisted on as part of her journey toward better mental and physical health. He admired her commitment, even if he didn't quite understand the appeal of hot yoga sessions where the room was heated to unbearable temperatures. Once Emily had retreated to their bedroom, James poured himself a glass of whiskey, a smoky single malt he had been saving for no particular reason, and settled into his favorite chair in the living room. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the dishwasher and the occasional creak of the old floorboards. James pulled out his phone, opened the anonymous confession app he had been hooked on for months, and began scrolling. The app was his guilty pleasure, a small indulgence he allowed himself after long, taxing days. People shared all sorts of secrets there, some dark, some hilarious, and others so bizarre he couldn't help but laugh out loud. It wasn't just the content that intrigued him, it was the raw honesty. Strangers laid their souls bare, knowing they were protected by the shield of anonymity. As he scrolled, James skimmed through confessions that ranged from petty thefts to office gossip. One post read, "I've been stealing pens from my boss for 2 years and I have no plans to stop." Another said, "I told my wife I was working late, but I was actually at a Dungeons and Dragons game." James chuckled at that one. He appreciated the absurdity of these confessions, the way they made his own life feel simple and grounded. Then his thumb paused mid-swipe. The title of a post caught his eye. "I ruined my marriage." At first he thought nothing of it. Posts about infidelity were common on the app, practically a cliché. Yet something about this one compelled him to click. Maybe it was the bluntness of the title, or the fact that it came up just as he was starting to feel reflective about his own marriage. Either way, he tapped on the post and began reading. The confession was short but loaded with emotion. "I never thought I'd be the kind of person to cheat, but it happened. It started out innocently enough, just a few flirtatious messages with a coworker. My husband is kind and loving, but our relationship had become so predictable. I convinced myself I deserved to feel alive again, to feel wanted. One thing led to another, and I crossed a line I can never uncross. Now I live with the guilt every day, pretending nothing happened while my husband looks at me like I'm still the person I was before." James read the post twice, then a third time. His heart began to pound, though he couldn't explain why. There was no reason to think the post had anything to do with him. Thousands of people use the app daily. Surely this was just another stranger airing their regrets. And yet, certain phrases struck a chord. Our relationship had become so predictable. Had Emily ever said something like that? Maybe not in those exact words, but there had been moments, small comments, offhand remarks, that hinted at a deeper dissatisfaction. Then there was the mention of a coworker. James knew Emily got along well with her colleagues, particularly Ryan, the new marketing director who had joined her company 6 months ago. They had worked late on several projects together. James hadn't thought anything of it at the time. Emily was a professional and Ryan was married after all. Still, the uneasy feeling in his chest refused to go away. He checked the timestamp on the post. It had been uploaded an hour ago. Emily had gone to bed roughly an hour ago. James shook his head, trying to dismiss the thoughts swirling in his mind. He was being paranoid. The post was probably written by someone halfway across the country, but the coincidence was too glaring to ignore. Against his better judgment, he decided to test the waters. He typed a reply. "What would you say to your husband if you could confess?" For a moment he hesitated, his thumb hovering over the send button. Was he crossing a line by engaging with this stranger? But curiosity got the better of him, and he hit send. The message disappeared into the digital void, and James set his phone down, feeling a strange mix of guilt and anticipation. Later, as he climbed into bed, Emily was already asleep, her breathing slow and steady. He watched her for a moment, her face illuminated by the pale glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. She looked peaceful, untroubled, and for the first time in years, James found himself wondering if he really knew the woman lying beside him. James woke the next morning with a dull ache in his chest, the kind of weight that sits in your heart when something feels off. Emily was already up and bustling in the kitchen, her hum floating down the hallway. It was a routine sound, comforting on any other day. But today it grated on him. He shuffled into the kitchen, his hair a mess, and his mind more scrambled than the eggs she was flipping in the pan. Emily smiled over her shoulder when she saw him. "Good morning, sleepyhead. Coffee's almost ready." James forced a smile, mumbling a thanks as he poured himself a glass of water. Emily looked the same as she always did, her blonde hair tied back in a loose bun, her favorite oversized hoodie hanging off her slim frame. She didn't look like a woman harboring secrets. "Big plans today?" he asked casually, trying to gauge her reaction. "Not really," she said, turning back to the stove. "I might run a few errands, hit the gym. What about you?" James shrugged, sipping his water. "Same old. Meetings, spreadsheets. You know the drill." Their conversation felt routine, but James couldn't shake the nagging suspicion gnawing at him. He watched her as she plated the eggs and slid them onto the table, wondering if he was searching for something that wasn't there. When Emily left for the gym later that morning, James seized the opportunity to check the app. He felt ridiculous, like a teenager snooping through someone's diary, but his curiosity had only grown overnight. To his surprise, there was a reply waiting for him. The anonymous confessor had responded, "I'd tell him I'm sorry, that it wasn't about him, even though it feels like a betrayal of everything we built together. I'd tell him I hate myself for what I did, but I can't undo it. And I'd ask if he could ever forgive me, even though I don't think I deserve it." James stared at the screen, the words blurring together as his mind raced. It was just a coincidence, he told himself again. There was no way this person could be Emily, but the guilt and self-loathing in the reply felt eerily personal, as though it came from someone who knew him, someone who had spent years sharing a life with him. He debated whether to reply again. What would he even say? Instead, he decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He checked Emily's phone records. James wasn't proud of himself. In fact, as he opened the phone bill on his laptop, his stomach churned with guilt. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away, and he needed to know. The log showed the usual calls to Sarah, her mom, and a few friends from work. But there was one number that stood out, a number he didn't recognize that appeared repeatedly over the last few months. It wasn't just calls. There were dozens of text messages, often late at night. James copied the number and did a quick online search. It didn't take long to connect the dots. The number belonged to Ryan, the marketing director she had mentioned in passing. His blood ran cold. He slammed his laptop shut and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know what he had expected to find, but seeing Ryan's name made his worst fears feel tangible. Still, it wasn't definitive proof. They worked together. Of course they'd communicate. But why so late at night? And why so often? James felt like he was grasping at straws, trying to piece together a puzzle without all the pieces. By the time Emily returned from the gym, James had tucked his emotions back behind a neutral facade. She kissed him on the cheek as she passed, her skin still flushed from her workout. "You okay?" she asked, noticing his distracted expression. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Emily nodded, not pressing further, and James watched as she disappeared into the shower. His phone buzzed on the table, and he glanced at the screen. Another reply on the confession app. I know I need to tell him. He deserves the truth. But I'm terrified it'll destroy him. And us. Is it better to live with the guilt and keep pretending, or to risk losing everything by coming clean? James's stomach turned. It felt like the universe was playing a cruel joke on him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed answers. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, James decided to push further. He sent another reply. If you want forgiveness, you need to tell him the truth. Secrets like this always come out eventually. Don't you think he deserves to hear it from you, rather than finding out some other way? He hesitated before hitting send, wondering if he was inadvertently setting off a chain of events he wouldn't be able to stop. But his finger moved before his mind could change, and the message was gone. James stared at the ceiling long after sending the reply, Emily's soft breathing filling the room beside him. For the first time in their marriage, he felt like a stranger in his own home. The weekend arrived with its usual routines, but James's mind was far from the calm normalcy he tried to project. Emily had planned a Saturday brunch with her yoga friends, a group he barely knew apart from their occasional appearances at house gatherings. As she got ready in their bedroom, James sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, pretending to finish up some work. In truth, he was waiting. The confession app had become a portal he couldn't tear himself away from, a window into a secret that might or might not belong to the woman he thought he knew. He had left another reply the night before, and when he checked his notifications, his pulse quickened. The confessor had responded. I've thought about telling him so many times, but every time I imagine the look on his face, it stops me. He doesn't deserve this. He's always been there for me, through everything. But I can't escape the feeling that something is missing. I wanted to feel seen again, alive again. I know how selfish that sounds, but it's the truth. James's stomach churned. The words hit too close to home, echoing thoughts he didn't want to admit he'd had about his own marriage. Was this really Emily, or was he projecting his insecurities onto the words of a stranger? You ready? Emily's voice pulled him back to reality. James glanced up, startled. She stood in the doorway, her hair perfectly styled, wearing the yellow sundress he'd always loved. For a brief moment, he was struck by how beautiful she looked, and a pang of guilt stabbed through him. What was he doing, doubting her like this? Yeah, he said, clearing his throat. You look great. Emily smiled, grabbing her purse. Thanks. Don't work too hard while I'm gone, okay? She kissed him on the cheek before heading out the door, leaving James alone with his thoughts. The moment the door clicked shut, James opened a new tab on his laptop and began digging deeper. He couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was somehow connected to all of this. His LinkedIn profile was easy enough to find. Ryan Parker, marketing director. From there, James found Ryan's social media accounts. The man looked every bit the part of the charming, confident coworker. Sharp suits, a bright smile, photos from conferences and office parties. James scrolled through the posts, his jaw tightening as he spotted a photo from a recent work event. There was Emily standing next to Ryan, both of them smiling. It wasn't just the photo that bothered James. It was the way Ryan's hand rested lightly on her back, a gesture so subtle it could be dismissed as nothing. But to James, it felt like a breadcrumb leading to something bigger. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. He needed proof, something tangible. Over the next hour, James fell down a rabbit hole of surveillance apps and phone trackers. He hated himself for even considering it, but desperation was a powerful motivator. Eventually, he settled on an app that claimed to sync text messages and call logs to a secure dashboard. He installed it on Emily's phone under the guise of updating their shared calendar app, and within minutes it was set up. James felt sick to his stomach. This wasn't the man he wanted to be, paranoid, distrustful, sneaking behind his wife's back. But he couldn't shake the image of Ryan's hand on Emily's back, or the words of the anonymous confession. He told himself it was better to know the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. Later that evening, Emily returned from brunch in high spirits. She chatted about her friends, their conversations, and an upcoming yoga retreat one of them had suggested. James nodded along, his responses automatic. You okay? Emily asked, tilting her head. Yeah, just tired, James replied, offering a weak smile. Emily leaned in and kissed his forehead. Don't stay up too late. She went to bed early again, leaving James alone with the silence of the house. He opened the dashboard for the app he had installed and immediately felt his chest tighten. There were dozens of messages between Emily and Ryan. Most of them seemed harmless at first, work-related, updates on projects, but then he scrolled further. Ryan, can't stop thinking about the other night. Emily, me too. I don't know how we keep this under wraps. I feel like it's going to blow up in my face eventually. Ryan, let's talk tomorrow after the meeting. I'll cover for us. James stared at the screen, his pulse pounding in his ears. His worst fears were confirmed, laid bare in the cold, clinical text of a chat log. The words blurred as rage, betrayal, and heartbreak swirled inside him. He closed the app and sat in silence, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to confront Emily immediately, to throw the evidence in her face and demand answers. But another part of him, calmer, colder, wanted to wait. If the confession on the app was hers, she might be closer to telling him the truth than he realized. That night, James lay awake in bed, his back turned to Emily. He didn't feel like he could breathe, let alone sleep. For the first time, he began to see the cracks in their marriage, not as small imperfections, but as the gaping wounds they truly were. James didn't wake up feeling rested the next morning. In fact, he doubted he had slept more than an hour. The weight of what he had uncovered pressed heavily on him, like a boulder sitting on his chest. Emily, as if oblivious to the storm brewing inside him, moved around the kitchen cheerfully, humming a tune as she poured herself coffee. I was thinking of trying that new cafe downtown later, she said, breaking the silence. You know, the one Sarah keeps raving about. Want to join me? James forced a smile. Maybe. I've got some things to catch up on, but we'll see. Emily seemed satisfied with the answer and didn't press him further. As she leaned against the counter sipping her coffee, James studied her. The way her lips curved into an absent-minded smile, the way her hair fell loosely over her shoulder. It all looked so normal, so familiar. But now that familiarity felt like a mask, and James couldn't tell what was real anymore. Once she left the room, James grabbed his phone and opened the confession app. There were no new responses from the anonymous user, but he had half expected that. What could they possibly say now that would change the reality of what he'd already seen? Still, his fingers hovered over the screen, debating whether to send one last reply. Instead, he opened the synced dashboard of Emily's texts. He hated that he was relying on this invasive tool to piece together the truth, but he couldn't stop himself. The messages between Emily and Ryan had continued late into the night. Most were mundane and logistical, coordinating work schedules, planning a meeting, but buried in the thread was a single text that felt like a knife to the chest. Ryan, last night was incredible. I don't know how I'm supposed to go back to pretending we're just co-workers. James clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. He wanted to throw the phone across the room, but he forced himself to stay calm. He took a deep breath, trying to think rationally. Confronting her now, without a plan, wouldn't get him the answers he needed. If anything, it might push her further into secrecy. Later that afternoon, James decided to do something he hadn't done in years. He went for a drive. No destination, no purpose, just the open road in his thoughts. He turned onto the highway, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thrum of the tires, the only sounds accompanying him. His mind churned over everything he'd discovered, the texts, the confession, and most painfully, the memories of his life with Emily. He thought about the day they met, a chance encounter at a bookstore where they had both reached for the same copy of The Great Gatsby. He thought about their wedding day, how radiant Emily had looked in her simple lace gown. He thought about the late-night talks, the vacations, the inside jokes that only they understood. How had it all unraveled so quietly? How had he missed the signs? The car's fuel gauge pinged, pulling James out of his reverie. He pulled into a small gas station off the highway, its faded sign swaying in the breeze. While the car filled up, James stood leaning against the pump, staring into the distance. He realized he was at a crossroads, not just literally but figuratively. He could confront Emily now, unleash the anger and heartbreak boiling inside him, or he could wait and let the truth come out on its own. By the time he returned home, he had made up his mind. He would give Emily the chance to confess. If the anonymous user on the app was truly her, she would have to face her guilt eventually. And if it wasn't her, well, he wasn't ready to think about that yet. That evening, James sat on the couch pretending to watch TV while Emily flipped through a magazine. The tension in the room was palpable, at least to him. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, wondering what thoughts were running through her head. Was she thinking about Ryan? About what they had done? Or was she, as she appeared, simply enjoying a quiet evening at home? James, Emily said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. He turned to look at her, his heart pounding. Was this it? Was she about to confess? Yeah, he said, keeping his tone even. She hesitated, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the corner of the magazine. Are you happy? The question caught him off guard. What do you mean? I mean, with us, with our life. She avoided his gaze, her eyes fixed on the coffee table in front of her. James's mind raced. Was this her way of opening up, of testing the waters before revealing the truth? He chose his words carefully. I thought I was, but lately, I don't know. Something feels different. Emily finally looked up at him, her expression unreadable. I've been feeling the same way, she admitted, like we're just going through the motions. James's heart sank. This was it. The cracks were starting to show, and he couldn't tell if they were heading toward repair or collapse. Before he could respond, Emily stood up abruptly. I need some air, she said, grabbing her jacket and heading for the door. James didn't stop her. Instead, he sat there in silence, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing in his ears. He picked up his phone and opened the confession app once more. He didn't know why he kept returning to it, but it felt like his only lifeline to the truth. To his surprise, there was a new reply waiting for him. You're right. He deserves the truth. I just don't know if I'm strong enough to say it. James stared at the message, his chest tightening. He realized then that the confessor, and possibly Emily, was closer to breaking than ever before. He just didn't know if their marriage would survive what came next. The next morning felt different. The air in the house was heavy, like the moments before a storm. Emily moved quietly through her morning routine, avoiding James's gaze. Normally, she would hum softly while making coffee or comment about the weather. Today, there was none of that. She was unusually still, almost cautious. James sat at the table with his laptop, pretending to check emails. In reality, his eyes flicked between the screen and Emily, who stood by the sink washing her mug. He didn't need the confession app to tell him something was brewing. He could feel it. Emily finally broke the silence. James, she said, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. He looked up, trying to keep his face neutral. Yeah? She turned to face him, drying her hands on a dish towel. Her expression was conflicted, as though she was waging a war within herself. Can we talk? I mean, really talk? James's heart thudded in his chest. This was it. He set his laptop aside and nodded. Of course. What's on your mind? Emily hesitated, wringing the towel in her hands. She took a deep breath, then sat down across from him. Her eyes darted around the room before finally settling on his. I've been holding something in for a while, she began, her voice trembling, and it's been eating away at me. I don't even know where to start. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Just start wherever feels right, he said, keeping his tone calm, even as his stomach churned. Emily took another deep breath. There's no easy way to say this, so I'll just say it. I've been unfaithful. The words hung in the air, sharp and cutting. James felt like the wind had been knocked out of him, even though he'd been expecting it. Hearing her say it out loud made it real in a way the text messages and app replies hadn't. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, hurt, disbelief. He looked at Emily, searching her face for some hint of the woman he thought he knew, but all he saw was guilt and pain. How long? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily flinched as though the question itself had struck her. A few months, she admitted. It started as, I don't know, just harmless flirting at work. I didn't think it would go anywhere. But then it did, and I let it happen. James's hands clenched into fists under the table. With Ryan? Emily's eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded. How did you? I'm not stupid, Emily. James cut her off, his voice sharper now. I've seen the texts. I've known something was off for weeks. Hell, maybe months. But I gave you the benefit of the doubt because I trusted you. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes and she reached out toward him, but he pulled back. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I hate myself for what I've done. I've been wanting to tell you, but I was so scared of losing you. James laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Scared of losing me? You already lost me the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you. Emily wiped at her eyes, her shoulders shaking. It wasn't about you, James. It was never about you. You've been an amazing husband. This was about me, about my insecurities, my stupid need to feel wanted in a way that I didn't think I deserved. That's a hell of a justification, James said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. It's not a justification, Emily replied, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her face. There's no excuse for what I did. I'm just trying to explain, to make you understand that it wasn't because of anything you did or didn't do. This was my failure, not yours. James stood abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He couldn't sit there anymore, couldn't look at her, without feeling the overwhelming urge to yell or cry or both. You should have thought about that before you decided to blow up our marriage, he said coldly. Emily flinched again, her tears flowing freely now. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, she said, but I'm asking for it anyway. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, James. I'll quit my job. I'll go to therapy. Stop, James interrupted, holding up a hand. Just stop. The silence between them was deafening. James paced the room, running a hand through his hair as he tried to collect his thoughts. He didn't know what to say, what to do. Part of him wanted to walk out the door and never look back. Another part wanted to stay and fight for the life they had built together, even though it now felt like a house of cards. Finally, he turned to face her. I need time, he said simply. Emily nodded, her expression a mix of relief and despair. Take all the time you need, she said. I'll wait. I'll wait as long as it takes. James didn't respond. He grabbed his keys and walked out the door, needing to get away from the house, from her, from everything. As he drove aimlessly through the city, he thought about the confession app and how it had led him to this moment. He wondered if he would ever be able to look at Emily the same way again, or if the damage was too great to repair. The one thing he knew for certain was that his life would never be the same. James drove aimlessly through the city, the night pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. The streets blurred past, bathed in the glow of streetlights and the occasional neon sign. He couldn't stop replaying Emily's confession in his mind, the words cutting deeper each time. I've been unfaithful. It wasn't just the betrayal itself that hurt, it was the implications. The life they'd built together, the trust, the shared dreams, the little moments that made them a team. It all felt like it had been undermined by her decision. James felt like a fool for not seeing it sooner. He pulled into the parking lot of a small park on the edge of town, killed the engine, and sat in silence. The stillness of the night pressed in on him, and for the first time he let himself cry. It wasn't the angry, stormy kind of crying he had expected. Instead, it was quiet, a slow release of everything he had been holding in. Eventually, his tears stopped, leaving him feeling hollow but clearer than he had in days. He knew he couldn't avoid the decision ahead of him. Did he try to forgive Emily, rebuild their marriage from the rubble, or did he walk away and start over? James grabbed his phone and opened the confession app one last time. He didn't know why, maybe for closure, maybe for guidance. The anonymous confessor had left one final reply to his last message. I know the damage I've done can't be undone. All I can do now is hope that my husband sees the good in me that I've forgotten exists. I know I don't deserve it, but I love him more than he'll ever know. I just hope it's enough to save us. James stared at the screen, the words sinking in. He didn't know if the confessor was Emily, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what he chose to do next. When James walked through the door that night, Emily was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest. She looked up at him with red, tear-streaked eyes. You came back, she said softly. James nodded, shutting the door behind him. He sat down in the armchair across from her, the space between them feeling like a chasm. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "But I also don't know if I'm ready to give up on us. Not yet." Emily's lip trembled, and she nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes, James. Therapy, quitting my job, anything. Just tell me what I need to do to fix this." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not about what you can do. This isn't something you can fix overnight, and it's not just about you. I need to figure out if I can let this go, if I can trust you again." Emily wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. "I understand. I'll give you whatever space you need." For the next hour they talked, really talked, for the first time in months. James laid bare his anger, his hurt, his doubts. Emily didn't defend herself. She simply listened, her own guilt and regret written across her face. By the end of the conversation, they agreed on one thing. They would try. It wouldn't be easy and it might not work, but they owed it to themselves to see if there was still something worth saving. Over the following weeks, James and Emily began the slow, painful process of rebuilding their marriage. Emily quit her job, cutting off contact with Ryan completely. They started attending couples therapy, where they learned to communicate in ways they never had before. There were days when James doubted his decision, when the pain of her betrayal felt too great to overcome. But there were also moments of hope, small gestures, quiet conversations, and shared laughter that reminded him why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. One evening, months after her confession, Emily handed James a letter. "I wrote this for you," she said, her voice trembling. "It's everything I wanted to say, but couldn't find the words for." James opened the envelope and read the letter in silence. In it, Emily poured out her heart, apologizing for her actions, explaining her struggles, and reaffirming her love for him. It was raw, honest, and deeply vulnerable. When he finished reading, James looked at her. For the first time in a long time, he saw not just his wife, but a flawed, human woman who was trying her best to make amends. "I'm not ready to say I forgive you," he said, setting the letter down, "but I'm ready to keep trying, one day at a time." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That's all I can ask for." And so they began again, not as the couple they once were, but as two people willing to fight for a future that might still hold something worth saving.